So was the Great Depression predictable? After all, the failure of the market economy to stabilize itself and return to prosperity in the wake of the great stock market crash is the most pivotal economic event in history. And the Austrians were virtually alone in seeing the development of this stock market bubble, its cause, and predicted the bust. In Austria, Ludwig von Mises saw the problem in its early stages. He wrote a full analysis that was highly critical of Irving Fisher's work on monetary economics. And this book was published in 1928. In the book, Monetary Stabilization and Cyclical Policy, Mises targeted Fisher's reliance on price indexes as a key vulnerability that would bring about the Great Depression, concluding, quote, "Because of the imperfections of the index number, these calculations would necessarily lead in time to errors of considerable proportions." Mises found that Fisher's attempt to stabilize the purchasing power of money was riddled with inherent technical difficulties and was incapable of achieving its goals. He then demonstrated how Fisher-type monetary policy caused booms, and that these booms inevitably result in crisis. In addition to demonstrating the inevitability of the crisis, Mises clearly identified the cause, where most others simply could not. He showed that the central bank's attempt to keep interest rates low and to maintain the boom only make the crisis worse. And despite the tremendous odds against the adoption of the Misesian solution, he ended his analysis with a prescription for preventing future crises. Quote, "The only way to do away with, or even to alleviate, the periodic return of the trade cycle with its denouement, the crisis, is to reject the fallacy that prosperity can be produced by using banking procedures to make credit cheap." As Frank Shostak wrote in the foreword to the latest edition of Mises's The Cause of the Economic Crisis, quote, "Here we have evidence that the master economist, Ludwig von Mises, who foresaw and warned against the breakdown of the German mark, as well as the market crash of 1929 and the depression that followed." And in addition to Mises, his student F.A. Hayek also predicted in 1929 the collapse of the American boom. Well after the fact, Fisher noted that he had discovered that price indexes have theoretical imperfections. But even in 1932, he thought that economic recovery was close at hand. This sort of reminds me of Chairman Bernanke, who has told us recently that we are in the early stages of economic recovery. Of course, he's been telling us that for the last 14 months, and doesn't seem to have come about. Fisher felt that recovery was based on reflationary measures by the central bank that were the deliberate human effort more than the mere market pendulum reactions. Unfortunately, not only was his prediction wrong, the world was only at the end of the beginning of the Great Depression. The human effort that he thought was the tonic of recovery, the central bank pumping in money, it was not the tonic of recovery, it was actually the toxin of lingering depression. The next economic crisis was the great stagflation of the 1970s. The 1960s were considered or called the go-go years. And it was an economic boom. We had new technologies, which is a recurring theme, and a stock market in a bubble. Credit for the boom times was attributed to the new scientific management of the economy by the new economist of the Keynesian school. They brought a new scientific approach of adjusting fiscal and monetary policy so as to prevent the business cycle. And the United States, after all, was able to fight the Cold War, the Vietnam War, and the war against poverty all at the same time, and maintaining a boom in the economy. And of course, there was new technology like computers. The first time we'd ever had computers. The first time we ever had space travel. And so naturally, everybody thought, yeah, this time it's different. This time is really different. We have a new era. And so you see this pattern developing here with mainstream economics. They think that they can scientifically manage the economy. They can use monetary policy and fiscal policy, and they believe they can bring about a new era of perpetual prosperity. They believe that they can kill off the business cycle. However, what they're actually doing is simply creating a boom in the economy, not true sustainable prosperity. They become overconfident in their abilities, and that's usually a good sign that an economic crisis is right around the corner. For example, academic economist Arthur Okun, who was a prominent member of President Johnson's Council of Economic Advisors in the 1960s, right before the first recession of the 70s began, he described the economy and the expansion as unparalleled, unprecedented, and uninterrupted. And Okun believed that the economy was on a new dramatic departure from the past. Quote, "The persistence of prosperity has been the outstanding fact of American economic history of the 1960s. The absence of recession for nearly 9 years marks a discrete and dramatic departure from the traditional performance of the American economy." So after declaring that he had killed off the business cycle, he even said that research on business cycles was no longer necessary. It was a thing of the past and had been replaced by the new Keynesian approach. And according to Okun, the older fiscal religion of limiting the size of government and keeping the budget in balance was based on myth and superstition, and that overthrowing these superstitions and embracing scientific management of the economy had allowed him and his fellow economists to fully subdue the business cycle. It's unfortunate for Okun that this publication of his book about slaying the business cycle took place 1 month before the recession hit. Eventually, unemployment exceeded 9% in the United States, which is the highest rate since the Great Depression. It remained above normal rates, above the normal rate for nearly 2 decades, including 10 double-digit months in the early 1980s. And it was also a period characterized by high rates of inflation by the typical standards in the United States, and it was punctuated by several painful recessions. The Dow, the Dow Jones Industrial Stock Average, lost more than 80% of its real inflation-adjusted value, which is about the same amount it lost during the Great Depression. Now, in contrast to the Keynesians, Austrians were writing at the end of the 1960s about the return of the business cycle. In his last interview of his life, in 1969, Ludwig von Mises talked about our current monetary problems. He made clear that inflation was the most important economic problem, and that the new economics of inflationism was producing a false economy. Mises said that, quote, "What is needed in order to avoid all of these unwelcome effects of inflation is to restore honesty in the conduct of monetary policy." This, of course, implies that he viewed current monetary policy as dishonest, and he was, of course, correct. We ended up going off the gold standard shortly thereafter. At the same time, Henry Hazlitt, another great Austrian economist, was writing in the 1960s relentlessly of the looming crisis. In particular, he wrote about how inflation was caused by government, warned against budget deficits, the looming dollar crisis, the false prosperity of Keynesian economics, the worldwide currency disorder, the failure of the new economics, the runaway spending by government, the coming monetary collapse, and the need to restore a true gold standard. Likewise, Murray Rothbard penned an important monograph on the Austrian theory of the business cycle in 1969, right before this crisis emerged. He wrote, and this is as timely as ever, quote, "The time is ripe for a rediscovery, a renaissance of the Mises theory of the business cycle. It can come none too soon. If it ever does, we would see a massive retreat of government from the economic sphere. But for all this to happen, the world of economics and the public at large must be made aware of the existence of an explanation of the business cycle that has lain neglected on the shelf for all too many tragic years." And of course, this is still true today. All things seem to be moving in the right direction. I published another article about the predictions surrounding the tech stock bubble of the late 1990s. In one survey, I looked at how government economists and what they were saying about bubbles, and found that most of them were babbling about bubbles, whether they could be identified, what the best anti-bubble policy was, or if there was no policy at all, that bubbles were both rational and irrational, that stocks, there was one that said that stocks were actually undervalued in 1929, that globalization could increase or decrease the severity of bubbles, that bubbles should be targeted, and that sometimes they should not be targeted. There was agreement amongst these government monetary leaders that if asset prices do exist, then they are inevitable, whether they are rational or not. Obviously, these conflicting, contradictory, and inane findings from our government's monetary leaders are quite unsettling, especially given that all those papers were published in 2003 after this bubble and collapse had already taken place. I also surveyed business economists using the Wall Street Journal's semi-annual survey of economists for the years just before and after the peak in the tech stock bubble. It seems like as the further you went into the bubble, the higher the stock market went, the more and more bullish these business economists became. In fact, right before the crash, they were practically euphoric, with one economist stating just days before the beginning of the crash, quote, "There is no end in sight to this expansion." So, like 3 days later, it ended. Looking at the forecast of the Congressional Budget Office, the White House, and the blue chip forecasters, we also see a clear pattern. When the economy was following sort of a normal growth pattern or trend during the early 1990s, their forecasts were pretty good. However, when the economy moved into the bubble of the late 1990s, the forecast from all three groups underestimated economic growth in GDP. After the crash, all three groups overestimated GDP. And on average, they were off the mark by about 20%. And if you only include the bubble and bust, it's by a much larger percent that they were off in their forecasts. In other words, of all of these economists, basically this demonstrated that they could draw a straight line, and that's about it.